네, 이제 2021 정책공공외교포럼의 마지막 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 세션은 포스트 코로나 시대의 정책 주창을 위한 디지털 공공외교라는 주제로 공공외교 연구의 대가이신 얀 멜리슨 네덜란드 클링겐델 선임연구원님의 기조 발제와 라운드테이블 토론이 진행이 됩니다. 이번 세션의 사회는 한국외국어대학교 교수님이시자 한국공공외교학회 소통위원회의 이사님으로 계시는 이윤아 교수님께서 맡아주시겠습니다. Now we are in the fourth session of the 2021 Public Diplomacy Forum. As the last session, we have invited Dr. Jan Melissen, who will deliver a keynote speech. Dr. Melissen is a senior research fellow at Klingendael Institute in Netherlands and a world-renowned scholar in the field of public diplomacy. Following the keynote speech, there will be a roundtable discussion with the topic of digital diplomacy for policy advocacy in a post-pandemic world. And this session's moderator is Professor Yuna Lee from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. So now I will hand over my mic to Professor Lee.
Okay, hello everyone. This is Yuna Lee, Dean of International Affairs at Hankuk University, and also Professor of Media Communication. I'm honored to chair this roundtable, which hosts renowned public diplomacy scholar Jan Melissen and our four excellent panel members. EMC already had went through Jan Melissen's CV, but I have something to add to his very excellent career. Most recently, he received the 2022 Distinguished Scholar Award from the International Studies Association. So I would like to relay my congratulations on that award, Professor Melissen. And let me also introduce the excellent panel members who will enrich our discussion. First, we have Dr. Ilan Manner, visiting fellow at USC Center on Public Diplomacy. I think I see him in our Zoom screen. Hi. And also Dr. Lee Kyung-sun, Assistant Professor for Zayed University, UAE. Kyung-sun, are you online as well?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, nice to have you here. And thirdly, we have physically offline Director Lee Chung-kwon from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he is current director for Policy Communication Division 1. And probably the camera can, we have Director Lee here as well, offline. And fourth, we have Officer Sophie Park from the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Korea. She's the Senior Public Diplomacy Officer, and Sophie is also offline with us here as well. So today we are going to talk about how we are going to look at and research digital diplomacy in a post-pandemic world. And Dr. Melissen will be giving an excellent keynote speech, and we are going to continue our discussion after his keynote speech. Professor Melissen? Hello.
I'm here this time. Hello, good morning, good afternoon.
Good evening, actually, from Seoul. So, are you ready to provide the keynote speech?
I am, absolutely.
Okay. Well, now let's have Dr. Melissen.
Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me at this conference. I'm sorry I had a little delay in actually connecting with the microphone. It's wonderful to be here, and I hope everybody is well in Seoul and safe with the pandemic. I would like to thank Professor Cho Ki-suk, President of the Korean Association for Public Diplomacy, and also Dr. Kim Tai-won, for inviting me, and for all the other, thanks to all the other colleagues for putting on this event. I'm accepting the new normal, as we're all living the new normal from day to day. At the same time, I deeply regret, and as everybody in Seoul who knows me I deeply regret that I cannot be physically in Seoul for the live experience. I miss the streets of Seoul. I miss the scent of Seoul. I miss the adrenaline of going to a conference, of being in Korea. I miss not researching. I miss in Korea. I miss the whole human experience. So this is my first live encounter, dear audience, with the KAPD. And I have a difficulty memorizing acronyms, so I call it KA4PD. At least that distinguishes it from KPDA, which would be the Kenyan Property Developers Association, or KPD, which would be the Communist Party of Germany, mind you, in the former East Germany. So it's KA4PD, and I think KA4PD is a really good thing. I've been in Korea for the first time in 2006, and there has been a continuous attention for public diplomacy in Korea, and the launching of this association, I believe, is a very good thing for 3 reasons. First, we are not there yet in the sense that this pair of words, public and diplomacy, deserves much more fundamental reflection. Public diplomacy has become enmeshed with the publics, has become public, has become societized in much more profound ways and much wider ways and deeper than a discussion on public diplomacy might suggest. So this new condition of diplomacy embedded in society, working with society, is something I think is the hallmark of diplomacy today, and that is where KA4PD can make an important contribution. I believe also that KA4PD is a great platform for academic research, indeed Korean research on diplomacy. Most Koreans that I have met have a PhD from an American university and have researched international relations in American traditions that often steered them away from looking at diplomacy. The rise of diplomatic studies in Korea I see as a very significant development. And I'm also really proud that in my own journal, the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, I have contributions from Koreans, global Koreans in 1919 and 1920. Thirdly, I think the idea of KPD is important because research on public diplomacy and digital diplomacy has been very much colored by Western approaches and dominated by a Western or even US perspective. And that is not the whole story. So that, I think, is where it is also immensely important to do this, to have this initiative. So my reflections today are sort of trying to connect, reconnect, continue to connect between public diplomacy and digital diplomacy. I'm not going to offer a talk on digital diplomacy, which consists of magic tips and tricks, do's and don'ts. I'm not going to play the university professor and give grades for countries that are doing well and bad grades for countries that are doing badly. And even less am I going to talk about soft power rankings that, quite understandably, in a place like Korea, are receiving some criticism because indeed it's always the same players that are on top. And the soft power rankings are, of course, also very much a commercial tool by those who make them. So I would like to invite the other panelists to join me later in reflecting on what we have learned from, say, 2 decades of practice on public diplomacy, and also to invite the academic speakers to reflect on what we have learned in a period of only roughly 5-6 years of academic publishing on digital diplomacy, with, of course, as the attraction of academic publishing in this field, that it is hip. So one is widely quoted, which always helps in academia. But at the same time, we see that technological change is so fast, and there have been so many political surprises that it is actually hard to produce academic work that has a good sell-by date. I always advise my students when they read on digital diplomacy to be aware of the publication date, because indeed the atmosphere was very different in 2014, 15, say before the American elections, say before the Russian annexation of Crimea and other events. The whole rise of the debate about disinformation has changed the face of the practice and also the research of digital diplomacy. So I'm looking really at reconnecting the two in my talk, if I may. And my favorite definition of public diplomacy is still propaganda for diplomats. And not because I think it is the right definition, but I think it is a fundamentally flawed definition that does remind us of an ongoing issue in practice. And it does remind us of the fact that when we have a definition of diplomacy that we think is perfect, it's a normative definition, that the world is going its own way. And we can recently see that, for instance, the three powers are developing their own take on public diplomacy, what it is. We see how China has, after a long time, trying to sort of join the discourse on public diplomacy, has been much more unashamed in developing its own line of party state, party public diplomacy, telling the world why China is a better model, even being more confrontational. We see that Russia, another great power, that authoritarianism, nationalism, and a disregard for international norms have infused public diplomacy, and indeed also digital diplomacy, in ways that really perhaps make it necessary to be flexible about how we conceptualize it if we want to call public diplomacy a reflection of actual practices. And the United States, of course, we can only wonder with trepidation whether we have reached the high watermark or where we may return to a situation in 2024 where we see a populist rejection of public diplomacy as a sort of an anti-liberal tool of international, as a liberal tool of international relations that deserves to be condemned. So more than ever, public diplomacy has become a contested norm, a contested notion rather, with not even a consensus in the European Union. So where to go from here? And I've actually been inspired by the blog that Kim Taiwan has written for the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, and which is now online, where he says, well, with all of this going on, actually there is a space to act in concert, a need to act in concert, and perhaps to rethink how we think about soft power, to make public diplomacy less state-based, and as far as it is state-based, as an activity in concert, quoting Hannah Arendt, in concert with other countries. So then soft power as state-based would be collective soft power, and public diplomacy of non-great powers would be more coalition-based. So soft power is then not only something that is acquired through socialization in a relationship with other countries, but also something that can be shared at a multilateral plane. And here we see that how fundamental it is to think through such key concepts. And in this perspective that Kim Taiwan is outlining, public diplomacy then becomes a part of national strategy, not an add-on, not something with a communication branch, but quite fundamental in where a country is going. And I think that also explains why public diplomacy in South Korea is taking on the reflections, and the practice of public diplomacy are taking on a different dimension as in many other countries. So as you can see, rather than diving straight into the digital diplomacy debate, I think it is important sort of to connect any discussion on digital diplomacy with the wider concepts, not to sort of silo it away from a discussion on public diplomacy. And there is a risk indeed with the digital diplomacy that we can also see in the literature to analyze the practices with more of a fascination with the adjective digital than with the actual noun of diplomacy. And who can be blamed for the fact that whilst we're standing in the middle of all what's happening, that it's hard to see the wood for the trees and to be fascinated with the technologies. Technology then becomes a fetish, and technological determinism is a danger, I think, in discussions, as we have seen and also seen in the past. Let us think of the 1990s with the discussion about the CNN effect, suggesting that television coverage was driving international politics. So digital, first of all, should not become a fetish, should be part of a wider discussion and be reconnected with public diplomacy all of the time. Still, it feels like where we are is a revolution, and indeed, one could argue that digital diplomacy is the largest upskilling exercise in the history of diplomacy. But here, we also have to be careful with our words. First of all, I would like to propose that accepting diplomacy per se as rather than episodic, continuous dialogue was, of course, a huge achievement in the history of diplomacy. So looking at the present developments, presentism should not lure us into thinking that's what's happening now is a more massive change than anything we have seen throughout history. I like the words of former US Secretary of State under the John Kerry under the Obama administration, who said digital diplomacy is diplomacy, period. And I'm sure some of the panelists may want to comment on that, why that is or why that is not the case. And it is true, of course, that digital media have an enormous reach and permeate almost all diplomatic activity one way or another. A perspective like reducing digital diplomacy to social media and what social media do to diplomacy, how they are employed in diplomacy, already gives us quite an entree of research. And indeed, a lot of research is on that aspect. In this talk, of course, I cannot go into how digital diplomacy, like public diplomacy, should be incorporated in the structures of foreign ministries and how it changes the work processes, the new media ecology, as probably Ilan would say, the new ecosystem that we see developing require an adaptation of fundamental work structures. And as we have seen that in other branches of the economy, sectors have been completely reshaped and work practices have been completely restyled because of entering the digital age. Here is also a huge task for diplomacy. I'm not going in that way. What I find fascinating for this talk today is the thought that digital diplomacy makes diplomacy more directly connected with publics everywhere. So digital diplomacy becomes, as it were, a sort of an accelerator of diplomacy's societization, of diplomatic actors' involvement with people. So the rise of digital diplomacy goes hand in hand with the omnipresence of public diplomacy, even where that is no longer mentioned. And I would like to make the case here that this is really epiphenomenal in the sense that we are looking at a very broad development of diplomacy becoming enmeshed with people, enmeshed with society, and that some of the core activities of foreign ministries that were seen as not diplomacy in the past are now very much, and that have to do with dealing with people, like public diplomacy or consular affairs, are at the heart of the work of the foreign ministry. So digital diplomacy then brings us, from my perspective, not into a field where we are just fascinated with technology, but we have to try and keep focusing on what's the interest, is the social consequences of new technologies, introduction in the conduct of international relations. That's what I've been trying to do in my own research, also in some research that could be called truly exotic. 2 articles for International Affairs in the past 2 years that I co-authored with early career authors looked at the digital public diplomacy of rebels in the Sahel and looked at the digital public diplomacy of Chinese UN celebrities, and looking at those very peripheral forms of digital diplomacy. I found ideas for what, and I will come back to that, for how we have to look at this field of study. Of course, broadly speaking, the new tools are indeed mind-blowing. Just to think that when in the history of diplomacy, diplomats emancipated from the sailing ship and could make a phone call, that was a huge development. But it was only a call. And the cable or the telegram that followed, people could send encrypted messages from the cable and the telegram. We see the introduction of the personal computer, a computer that can write, store, organize, and send information. And now we're in a world of meta machines with very layers of digital technologies, websites, apps, and a whole world of code and algorithms. Truly, that is a slightly different playing field, a playing field where in the future machines will get better at what diplomats do. They see, they hear, they understand, they translate, and they speak. So clearly, there are challenges ahead, and I can frankly admit some of whom where I've concluded that is not what I'm going to study, because that's where my comprehension of what is going on stops. Once again, I would like to underline, though, that these technical developments, fascinating as they are, they should not make us lose sight of the object of what we study, the social and relational aspects of technological change. So digital tools then are increasingly tools in an ecosystem that is digitalized. They're tools in a changing environment, and they're actually confronting us, even the digital immigrants, the digital tourists, people who are relatively new to this, with a world where we are increasingly becoming technological. And I've always found that here, South Korea should have an edge as a country that has sort of completely reshaped itself through the development of new technologies. So digital diplomacy then is not the end of diplomacy, but as the Chinese would say, it's about the rejuvenation of diplomacy. And increasingly we see that diplomatic activity meets people, and that is what's the focus of some of my research. Broadly speaking then, I think in research on public diplomacy, the fascination with communication is a strength, but perhaps also a weakness. When you're interested in the diplomacy as an academic or as a practitioner, you are probably looking at public diplomacy and digital diplomacy, not just because you are interested in communication and the other aspects. I think the other functions of diplomacy is also where we see the application of digital tools. It's not just about attention seeking, which has been a bit of an obsession in discussions about public diplomacy. No, it's also about information gathering. And that's where some of the experts could say a lot more on this. We want to trace sentiments, trace conversations, trace power and influence in the world. Who's talking to whom? Why? Where? What are these conversations like? And how can these conversations be influenced? PD is, of course, also there to help meet policy objectives. Think of commercial diplomacy, and public diplomacy is not just attention seeking, but also relationship management. So how to reconnect digital diplomacy and public diplomacy is, I think, is an important conversation where today's talk, I just give it a first step, sort of first thinking out loud why this is important, rather than indeed going down the alley of digital diplomacy and doing very detailed and methodologically rigorous research, but forgetting the connection with public diplomacy, or even not bothering about reading up on diplomacy as a whole. So when we use these words, I think we have to be truthful to an intellectual curiosity about broader practices rather than over specialization. Now, finally, for the final part of my talk, I would like to look at a couple of international developments. This is really by means of brainstorm that have been very much analyzed through the lens of digital diplomacy, but that equally perhaps require some reflection on public diplomacy as a concept and as a practice. And as I'm saying, this is no scholarly work. This is just a brainstorm. First of all, we see the rise of non-state actors, new non-state actors or not so new non-state actors, a variety, and with very unlikely newcomers like, say, ISIS or the Sahel rebels that I mentioned before. And then digital diplomacy discussions, some of the emphasis are then on the agency, the enhanced international agency that these actors have, and their enormous agility from which states can learn. So that being the case, I would like to turn then, so how can, looking through the lens of state public diplomacy, what can states also learn from this? And that is perhaps much more of a reflection on governmental PD, public diplomacy, in a multi-actor setting, and indeed, as I suggested before, borrowing from Kim Tai-wan's blog, in a coalitions of states and coalitions of states. Some of these states, of course, they already have a multilateral setting, like in the European Unions. Others do not have that luxury or reality, and so recommendation indeed to sort of to put in perspective the limitations of state public diplomacy and digital diplomacy, and with that, a reflection on concepts that perhaps lock us in that state perspective, including the concept of state power. Secondly, and again, it's just a brainstorm, populism in the heartland of the democratic world has also given an enormous impetus to research on digital diplomacy. There is a wealth of literature now on digital disinformation, and indeed that has also made it very important for us to think about the resilience of our societies. So it's very much at that end, and of course I'm skipping many other things, at that end where the scholarly attention is going, and the attention of practitioners. Again, shifting to the state public diplomacy perspective, this same debate could alert us to a greater awareness of the general public. Public diplomacy discussions have, right from the beginning, been very, and practice has been very much influenced by the idea that public diplomacy should find the influentials, the high potentials, those orbiting around decision makers, but actually some events, and I can only mention Brexit and the American elections, have shown us how consequential the general wider publics can be in public diplomacy. So greater awareness of other publics. Thirdly, the blurring of lines between foreign and domestic, that I have the impression even deserve, they should give us reason to reflect on the notion of foreign policy per se, but let me not go into that. In digital diplomacy, it certainly has triggered a lot of work on the complexity of communications. Shifting again to state public diplomacy, it seems to me, and there is a surprising acceptation of this already in foreign ministries, and something not alien in the Asian setting, in the East Asian setting, domestic public diplomacy has become a new priority. And indeed the practice deserves more reflection, because we are talking about, as is happening now in South Korea and elsewhere, much more of a realization that consultation with the public, with the domestic public, the development of deliberative democracy is something that needs attention for reasons of getting legitimacy as a government, as a foreign policy actor, for getting knowledge from society and transfer that to government, to create greater trust, or indeed to intrinsically empower publics on issues of foreign policy. So the whole idea of the domestic realm is an intriguing one, and one where we are only beginning to see, apart from occasional opinion, serious academic research, that the domestic realm as a priority for actors that are associated with international relations. Fourth and finally in this list, in this brainstorm, COVID-19 and its impact on international relations. And here in the digital diplomacy debate, we see that, of course, that COVID-19 is associated with the loss of physicality, which may sound like an inappropriate term, but is now quite commonly used in the literature, and also the loss of informality. The disinformation debate has also has had good material for study with COVID-19. From a state public diplomacy perspective, though, and that's again to try and make this reconnect in this exercise, this brainstorm exercise today, perhaps this points to the need in an era of enhanced geopolitical rivalry of a more human-centered public diplomacy, and we see the risk of the accentuation of cultural differences and even racism cropping up in international relations. So from a public diplomacy perspective, here my recommendation, still a recommendation, would be to sort of reevaluate the value of cultural relations, not in terms of national projection, not in terms of international attention seeking, but more as a practice of mediation, of bridge building, of strengthening the public diplomacy arsenal in that sense. Finally, yes, indeed, broad recommendations build on this very provisional brainstorm for foreign ministries. One, I've said it and said it again, think of public diplomacy in terms of coalitions, and indeed of what you want to achieve in this world in a coalition setting, and that sort of reignites the debate about middle powers, but it's a debate that should be truly updated, I believe, and is worth having, certainly for countries like South Korea, but also my own countries with ideas about a better world, but not the power similar to great powers. Secondly, of three recommendations, invest more in participatory diplomacy and deliberative democracy at home. Participatory diplomacy, so working with the home front, I think is a field where rightly also South Korea is experimenting, because this is a very experimental field. But I see also, for instance, in my own country, in the Netherlands, how this is an activity that has support from the top, not only political, but also at the highest levels of government. And of course, it is an activity where actually most expertise may reside in sectoral ministries rather than the foreign ministry. So the foreign ministry is in a way new to a game that is already quite familiar to many other players. But I see now, rather than ticking a box, we've consulted the public, ticking the box, we've consulted the stakeholders, a more intrinsic motivation to invest in working with home in terms on foreign policy issues. Also because the home public may see foreign policy issues different from the past, may increasingly see what's happening abroad in terms of the consequences for domestic safety, stability, for what foreign issues mean for home. Think of terrorism, think of migration flows, think about climate issues, global climate issues. Thirdly and finally, and that's where I shall stop, I think it is important for digital and public diplomacy research to focus on what happened to the messages of public diplomacy. There is an obsession with what the center is doing, what the strategies are, what the policies are, and the practices that are being rolled out. But what is actually happening at the receiving end with those practices and policies is quite important. So this may be research into the unintended consequences of PD messages, and that's where only one example is my own research with an early career co-author that was published a month ago or so in International Affairs that I mentioned on Chinese UN celebrity diplomacy, where celebrity diplomats accredited by the World Organization are actually engaged in practices that seem to be more closely aligned with the party state rather than the sending organization. And here there is more research that alerts us to indeed look at what happens with our public diplomacy. And that's where also the embassies have to be to tool up. I'm convinced that many embassies have no systematic understanding have no systematic data on what they have been doing in the past 5 years in public diplomacy, which does not equip them very well to evaluate those policies. So quite a job to be done there, I think, both for academia, but also in practice. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. As I said, it's been a bit of a brainstorm, but that is what these conferences are for, I hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mellison. He talked about how we should not really lose sight of the essence of public diplomacy and its objectives. And he focused on how he emphasized that we should not look into technology to the extent that it may become a fetish. And he rounded up with some suggestions for the ministry who are talking about or thinking about digital diplomacy, and about 3 to 4 points were raised by Professor Mellison, where we have to think about public diplomacy in a more coalition-based kind of advancement, rather than only a state-based or state-led activity with the given changes in the media environment. And secondly, he talked about that we have to think more about participatory nature of diplomacy because of the change in the media. And also he talked about how the domestic public diplomacy became a core issue for a lot of the ministries, unlike the analog media environment, because they have access to their own media. And fourthly, he also talked about how we should research and evaluate how the digital media, usage of digital media changed public diplomacy messages within the ministries and in the world. With these points summarized for you, I would like to invite our discussants. And first up is Dr. Ilan Manner. And I will give about 10 minutes to each of our discussants here. And Dr. Manner, would you start the discussion?
Yes, first of all, thank you all for inviting me to be here today with you, even though only digitally. I should probably start by saying good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are across the world. But here, for instance, in Israel, it's the morning. But it's a great pleasure to be here today, and especially to follow a talk by Jan, who I think very expertly laid out some of the issues at the intersection of public diplomacy and digital diplomacy. When we examine the trajectory of diplomacy's digitalization, I think it's clear that offline events have always shaped how diplomats use new technologies. For instance, the Arab Spring led to the mass migration of diplomats to social media sites. Some diplomats hoped to monitor online conversations and anticipate future shocks to the international system. Other diplomats hoped to foster relationships with foreign populations. The advent of disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda led diplomats to adopt big data and network analysis in order to map and halt disinformation campaigns. COVID-19 will be no different, and COVID-19 will also have an impact on how diplomats use digital technologies. Now, within the realm of public diplomacy, I think that offline events also change diplomats' language and the metaphor that diplomats use to conceptualize their craft. In a sense, social media led diplomats to use the term publics. Diplomats hope to engage with digital publics. And this term is important because a public has a voice, a public has needs, a public has desires, and the use of the term publics may have led diplomats to focus on relationship building online. So this is the connection between language, metaphor, and practice. But the advent of disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda brought about another language shift because diplomats started to speak about audiences. Now, in a sense, the public became a problem because diplomats believed that the public could easily be swayed and manipulated by false information and deepfake videos. So diplomats began to focus on protecting their audiences from disinformation. But the term audiences may have also shifted diplomats' activities from relationship building to information management. Indeed, one speaks at an audience, but one speaks with a public. And this is an important distinction. And I think that COVID-19 might bring on another important change in language, because from recent interactions with embassies and foreign ministries throughout the world, I've noticed that diplomats are increasingly using the term constituency. In a recent study that we've conducted in Israel, we evaluated the online activities of 11 foreign ministries during the COVID pandemic. And what we found across all foreign ministries is that in the early stages of the pandemic, in the first few months, diplomats aimed their communication at domestic users and not foreign ones. Some foreign ministries use digital tools to publish success stories, such as an ambassador's ability to arrange a specially chartered flight to help citizens return home. Other foreign ministries shared images of frantic consular departments trying to mount a global repatriation effort. Some foreign ministries also use digital communications to help domestic users make sense of these global events. And importantly, I think we need to remember that COVID was and remains an international, national, and personal crisis. It afflicted multilateral bodies, it afflicted nation states and individuals and their families. And citizens throughout the world turned to diplomats and to foreign ministries to gain insight into this global event and to better understand how COVID will impact the world, the nation, and the nation's place in that world. And I think that these findings that we have here in Israel are representative of a larger shift, because digitalization blurs the boundaries of the nation state. We know that citizens follow their foreign ministries online, and we know that foreign ministries openly court domestic publics. Why? Because foreign ministries hope to develop a domestic constituency which will help diplomats contend with smaller budgets, smaller roles within governments, and shrinking remits within governments. Now, the relationship between a constituency and its representative is more profound, I think, than a relationship between publics and diplomats. A constituency must be heard. A constituency must be allowed to take part in shaping policies. A constituency can raise grievances that representatives must address. And representatives gain their strength from constituency support, but they are also duty-bound to promote the interests of their constituency. In short, the term constituency is representative of a deeper relationship, possible relationship, between diplomats and individuals assembled online. And I think the term constituency should shape diplomats' use of digital technologies in the post-COVID world. Local and global users require the aid of diplomats if they are to make sense of complex events such as global pandemics or global competitions over regional hegemony. The world of diplomacy is becoming increasingly complex to fathom as global crises manifest locally, while local events drive global tensions. Now, diplomats are foreign policy and communication experts, and they can offer online users this form of sense-making. But diplomats are also duty-bound to identify the needs and grievances of local and global constituency and address these grievances. Diplomats are also duty-bound to engage constituencies in the foreign policy formulation process. In short, COVID-19 might actually lead to more meaningful relationships between diplomats and those assembled on digital platforms. The vision of the so-called new public diplomacy, long forgotten after half a decade of propaganda bots and echo chambers, may be renewed following the pandemic, but only if diplomats rise to the challenge and meet the needs of both global and local constituencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilan. Ilan has emphasized how we should not forget that offline events actually do lead to online events. And also he talked about how a crisis like COVID clearly tells us that there's kind of a different relationship building mechanism going on between the diplomats and the national global individuals. With that point taken, let me ask our second discussant, Dr. Lee Kyung-sun, to open the floor for her. Kyung-sun, you ready?
Yes. Thank you. Hi, I'm, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So thank you. My name is Kyung-sun Lee, and I'm an assistant professor at Zayed University in the UAE. Well, thank you, Dr. Melson, for your thought-provoking keynote address. Just much food for thought that you've offered us at this table today. So I want to just talk briefly, just bringing in some of the concepts that you've kind of, given us to explore further within the context of Korea. These are just these are my viewpoints, so I want to share some of the thoughts that came up as I was listening to your keynote speech, Well, and I have to say that in the context of Korea, if we go back a little bit historically, so Korea is one of the countries that started after the Second World War as a third world country, an underdeveloped country. And throughout the 60s, throughout 80s, the government's, I would say, its legitimacy building and its greatest goal was to propel the country from an underdeveloped nation state to an economically powerful country, and very much invested in gathering the people, with the motto that we can do this together. It's a very nationalistic discourse, and very much I would say, a strong national outlook to its campaigns, both inward and outward. And I believe that looking back at the past decade of Korea's public diplomacy, that this kind of an outlook has prevailed the past decade. And so the government's public diplomacy campaigns have been very much nationally centered, and it has been about creating an attractive image of the nation state as a culturally attractive, appealing, not just an economically developed nation state, but also very culturally appealing, and trying to steer the foreign public's image away from like political conflict with North Korea, for example. And so this kind of the public diplomacy has been very much centered around one-way projection of this positive national image creation. And even more recently, like if we look at the campaign, it's called Unboxing Korea. It's a very recent campaign. I'm not sure if it's still ongoing, but it's very recent. But it also seeks to introduce cultural elements of the country in terms of like the food and the dress and architecture, etc. And what I want to say is that at this point in time where we've been the whole public diplomacy, I would say, realm has been disrupted by COVID-19, and a lot of what we do has moved online. I don't want to talk about how we can manage public opinion or how we can manage the public viewpoints, but think about digital diplomacy as enabling more of a network diplomacy, a relational diplomacy. And this is also something that you have mentioned, Dr. Melson, in your speech, when we talk about the importance of bridge builders, for example. And I really like that term because Korea has so many resources. In addition to K-pop and BTS, Korea has bridge builders, and it needs to take notice of these bridge builders. Some of them are, for example, the domestic foreign residents, like migrant workers. Korea has experienced quite I would say quite an influx of immigration from foreign countries, unlike any time in the past. And for the country, it has been, in a way, a disruption in its culture, because the country has always, the dominant discourse is that Korea is comprised of a single ethnic race, an ethnic identity. And being the insular, kind of having this insular mindset, the influx of foreign, I would say, foreign population has created conflict within and outside. But these people are bridge builders, and like quite literally so. And so Korea now needs to go beyond one-way projection of promotional narratives to listening to these bridge builders, and to try to come up with ways that, if and when they go back, for example, how can we, use these resources for not just creating an appealing image, but to listen to them and to come up with agenda, public diplomacy agenda, because without listening, we can't come up with agenda that really is meaningful. I would say also network diplomacy is important. It has been discussed much in the past, and it has been explored through case studies like ICBL, the international campaign of ICBL, banning landmines, international. We understand that credibility is built not only through one-way projection of appealing messages, but through networks, but through structure. So building structure with civil society, with NGOs, is something that the country can pursue moving forward, and to try to consider not only a nation-centered, I would say, agenda, but also agenda that serves the public. So it's really diplomacy for the public. Things like fighting disinformation. So the country is an IT powerhouse. So what can Korea do to promote this, the strength of its IT, but not in a commercial way? I would say, gathering civil society, NGOs, other nation states in a network to counter disinformation. These are some of the things that the country can consider moving forward. And so I would say that my viewpoint of digital diplomacy is not only about narratives and management of public opinion, but really thinking about the structure of it and considering how we can use, how we can utilize this the network enabling structure moving forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, Young-sun. Dr. Lee has pointed out several of the particular characteristics that Korea has to kind of consider in terms of thinking of public diplomacy. And what she had referred to as positive national image through one-way message is called in public relations one-way communication model, actually. And she has argued that we have to go beyond this one-way propaganda message to two-way communication, where we listen more to the public and develop more participatory platform for public diplomacy through digital media. And she also talked about how we should think more about structure of these networks that can yield a better outcome for public diplomacy. And when I was listening to Dr. Lee, I could think of several constructs that in public relations that talk about the exact same motto here, but I will come back to that later. And let me have my third panelist, Lee Chung-kwan, Director for Policy Communication. Director Lee, would you go ahead?
My name is Chung-kwan Lee. I'm Director for Policy Communication at Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a pleasure and honor to give a short presentation, speak with you. It's very interesting to hear that public diplomacy and digital diplomacy have many aspects on, if I may, diplomacy as we have known for years. Let me give a short anecdote about myself. It's almost 20 years now when I passed a foreign service examination. It was very competitive at the time. I'm not sure how it is now. It was very competitive. And it took me 2 years to pass. When I knew that I had passed the examination, I rushed to my professor, who taught me a lot about the subjects I had to study. I expected him to be, as much happy as I was, but he was very calm. He said, "Congratulations, Mr. Lee, but in the coming years, diplomats' role will be diminished because of the advent of e-diplomacy. E-diplomacy at the time was coined by some scholars. I think e-diplomacy meant electronic diplomacy. I don't think people use this term anymore. Now it's been replaced with the new term, digital diplomacy. So I was very much disappointed, but for 20 years later, I mean now I don't think e-diplomacy has completely replaced us. The diplomats are still inactive, and their role is still important, I think. And the concept of public diplomacy is still unfamiliar to many people. I think it's well documented in the research, in academia. Public diplomacy is quite well known to new diplomats. But when I was studying political science, public diplomacy was not that well-known topic. At the time, I thought public diplomacy is about reaching out to your own constituency, as Mr. Manner mentioned. But now I know public diplomacy is very different form of diplomacy. So with digital diplomacy and public diplomacy, these make me feel that I have two left feet. Still, I'm not sure I'm fully familiar with these two concepts, but I can see that these two concepts have totally transformed how states act and how diplomats conduct their duties in the actual scene. As a practitioner of PD, I think digital diplomacy is a good opportunity for diplomats, but I believe it's just a tool. It cannot totally change the nature of diplomacy. Diplomacy, as I understand, is communication and human exchange, human-to-human exchange, I mean. So digital diplomacy can help people have a better understanding of others, but it cannot replace how people think and how people interact with others. So the COVID-19 is a kind of forced environment for diplomats, practitioners of PD, because people face-to-face exchange is limited, and so I couldn't go on a business trip abroad. Most of the time I just stayed in Korea, so we naturally turned to the tool of digital diplomacy. So my Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has actively producing digital contents now. We used to do this before, but after COVID, we put more efforts to produce content. We have changed our brand of our SNS channel. Our new brand of SNS channel is Korea's. It's Korea, and Z is spelled at the end of this new brand name. So we have 4 channels. In Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Twitter and YouTube. And our subscribers have dramatically increased over the last year, and it's very stimulating to us to see the number of subscribers are spiking these days as we upload more content to these channels. What I learned from this experience is that the nature of public diplomacy cannot be changed. when I first learned the concept of public diplomacy, there are several elements you have to keep in mind, like you have to know your audience well before reaching out to them, and you have to have a very, very good attitude to listen to others, so that you can understand their mind. So public diplomacy is basically an activity to win their hearts and minds. So you have to listen very carefully and with your full heart. That's what I learned. And persuasion matters, not coercion. So you have to persuade people to understand your views. And these principles are still valid when we reach out to the audience using digital diplomacy tools. For example, recently UNESCO, the well-known international organization, is doing an online campaign, Live Together. This campaign is meant to win the solidarity around the world despite COVID. Especially it's fighting racialism, racism, in certain country. So some people are attacked at broad daylight in the street, as you know very well. So UNESCO is now doing this campaign with the coalition of other countries. The South Korea, our country is one of the countries that are actively, promoting this Live Together campaign. The Foreign Ministry has now achieved 4 million people who have participated in this campaign. It's very stimulating and it's very impressive to us. So I think it's rightly pointed out by Professor Mellison that coalition-based public diplomacy is a next opportunity we have to look at in doing public PD efforts. So it's a good way to have empathy for others. At the same time, we can promote the universal value, the diversity, solidarity, and dignity of human. These kind of universal and timeless values are something PD practitioners should be after, I think. Right, I just mentioned a few things, but I will come back to you on the other points. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Director Lee. He talked about how the classic values of public diplomacy does not really change, although we are interested in using the digital media. And he introduced us to some of the channels, digital media channels that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs is running. It's quite a few. And I think I have a question for you on your comments later on. And now let me have my last panelist, Ms. Sophie Park, the Senior Public Diplomacy Officer for Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Korea. Sophie, would you start?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sophie Park, and as Professor Lee has just introduced me, I'm the Senior Public Diplomacy Officer and working in the Netherlands Embassy in Seoul. And first of all, thank you, Professor Jan Mellison, for your message. And also thank you for to be here and glad to be here and part of this discussion. My discussion will be more sharing my practical experience since I'm working in the embassy. So starting from the COVID-19, there were actually many changes made in the working environment. So our new way of working actually started, which was the digital diplomacy. And I see, and I agree that I actually don't agree that digital diplomacy is all about diplomacy, period. But I agree that digital diplomacy became an important part of the diplomacy, since we actually have 3 big major changes in the embassies as a working with the digital diplomacy. And these 3 ways I would like to share with you guys. The first one will be everything actually became to online basis. So we do conferences or forum as on webinar, like today we are having as a digital Zoom conference. And so for that, in our embassy, we actually have our studio in the embassy. So that was another new change. And for this to be happened, Netherlands has distribute NL toolkits for all the embassies can use. So we have a same branding, same strategy, and same speaking point for each different kind of theme, such as peace, justice, security, sustainable and inclusiveness, entrepreneurship, high-tech, human rights. Under different kind of theme, we have slogan, logo, key message, back wall for the studio, and giveaways and related photos, so that we can keep the consistent message to worldwide. And that was very positive change that I think that the change has made. And also we can find the logos, font, icons, and images that we can also use for our social media channels as well. And the second change that that we had was the social media. As he just mentioned, Netherlands also is having a lot of different kind of social media channels, including Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and YouTube, and etc. And a new challenge is a lot of social media challenge has arisen. As Mufa has just mentioned about this Live Together challenge, we also contributed, and also this Stay Strong kind of challenge. We also try to have a similar challenges for like climate change and etc. Few weeks ago, I was invited into one of this MOFA's gathering for embassies, public diplomacy members, and the UK has shared their great experience of using influencers through social media, which was using Blackpink for climate change theme, which I thought was very interesting, and then it was a good way of using influencers for social media. There is a greater impact of social media, but also there are some risks involved. Since on social media, there are a lot of information going around, so there are a lot of bias that could be used, and people can, because it's a two-way communication tool, people can express their feelings and information and thoughts. When they start to write replies on social media, we see sometimes a big bias of the replies. And also when it gets to reshare, people regram or reshare our message with their own thoughts added, then there is another risk of this digital diplomacy through social media. And also when there's a third party involvement, we see another risk. Also for social media, another risk that we see is this algorithm. If we don't know the exact how the algorithm works with the social media, we can, even though we have a good message, we cannot distribute it, or sometimes it's not a really good way of contributing message when the algorithm is involved. Third change that we have made was the digital archive system. So the Netherlands ministry does not have the paper archive anymore, so everything is digital archive. So every information is saved in the digital archive, even for like consular services, like for example, visa or the payment, even application for the project and everything. It's very convenient because everyone have an access. Even after COVID, all the employees have an access to this archive at home as well. Of course, we have a Netherlands server, so we have some security system, so it's kind of difficult to access through from home, but we can still have the access. But there's also another risk existence when if it gets hacked or there's always cybersecurity issue for the information. So this is some area that Ministry of the Netherlands is also working on as well, how we can actually can keep this safe and secure. But this is the homework for our side to complete. That's about it.
Thank you, Sophie, for sharing your practical experience and explaining to us the different kind of policy changes, not policy changes, but then organizational changes that the embassy had taken on, especially after COVID-19. I think it's really impressive that you switched all the paper documentation structure into digital archive, which would be very, I think it's an innovative move in terms of visa issues and so forth. It's really hard to switch to digital documentation from my experience. And with all these discussions, we have about 15 more minutes to go, so let me accept some questions from the floor and from Zoom or our viewers of YouTube broadcast and wrap it all up together. Now, I have actually one very long question from Dr. Tae-hwan Kim, and this is specifically posed for Professor Mellison, and let me read it out to you. I strongly concur with Mellison on his point that digital diplomacy makes diplomacy more directly connected to people and meshed with society. Taking one step further, what would you say about the potential of digital tools playing a role of shaping a common transnational identity today of people living in different countries across national borders? In parentheses, he adds, would like to remind you of Benedict Anderson's emphasis of the role of print media in the 19th century in shaping national identity and thus the rise of imagined communities and nationalism. So this was one of the questions that I had from Dr. Tae-hwan Kim. And would you have any questions from the physical floor here? No? Oh, okay.
Thank you for your presentation, and I have a question to Dr. Mellison, and your really famous quote, and the public diplomacy is like new wine in old bottle, like you mentioned back in 2006. I also quoted in my PhD dissertation, by the way. And I always wonder that the function and role of like these digital platforms, such as social media, how could we just share our values and culture to create another identity, for like collective identity, to have our countries like spread or diffusion of like country's thought and the sharing the same value and creating another identity. What is the meaning of that on the social media, and how the social media accelerates those kind of activities in the 21st century? And to me, those like activities or like those situation is not new. And previously, they're like back in early 2000. People just like people-to-people exchange is like meeting in person. But nowadays, like by using technology, and people share more, like create more discourses and sharing our thought more easily and gathering and also creating another cooperation. So what do you think of like next? And this is like in the middle of COVID situation. After COVID, what do you think that like actual like a meaning of public diplomacy by using this digital media and social activities online? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Dr. Mellison, you have about 2 questions here, and let me also pose 2 different questions for the discussants as well, so you will take turns to answer to these questions. For Dr. Manner, I have a question for you where I was really curious about whether you have any communication guidance on the use of digital media for Israeli diplomats, because you talked about how they use digital media differently with different purposes and different messages. So I got really to wonder whether the government also kind of liberate the diplomats to use their tools on their own, which is not really imaginable in Korea. So I have a question for you on that. And for Director Lee, I also have a question for you, where you talked about how the classic values don't really change. But from my experience in evaluation of government communication efforts and so forth, they tend to kind of not look at the value, but then they look at the outputs, where you have more subscribers, you have more hits, you have more sharing. So I really wonder if the ministry evaluates your digital PD efforts in that manner or in other ways. So if you can provide some answers to that, I think that would be really great. So starting from Dr. Mellison, Professor Mellison, would you talk to us about your comments to Dr. Kim and our questioner here at the floor? Yes.
Thank you so much. I shall keep this very brief, Professor Ree, because I've taken most time to speak at this in this conference, at this panel, and leave more time for the others. But the questions are very good ones, and very briefly, not going into a lengthy conversation with Dr. Kim, I think it is really interesting, and also in his own work, to see how the debate about middle powers has evolved from one that is state-based, and indeed how states have their own niches, where they have ideas about the world that they want to share, and where they can, as it were, punch over their weight with those ideas. That we are looking much more here now at states that have limited power resources themselves, but actually great intellectual and resources and ideas to look at shared identities and commonality of norms and values about the world we live in, that can strengthen such PD coalitions. And that would really be sort of coming public diplomacy of age. If you compare that to the early 2000s, where this was really seen as sort of crude nation branding. So leave it there. On the other point, on the use of new technologies and social media for an ongoing conversation after COVID, I would not like to overstate the impact of COVID, because many of these things have been going on before. But what I find really interesting, and that in my interviews with governments, because I've been quite slightly cynical as an academic, skeptical rather, about why do governments do this? Why do they talk to citizens? But I see that there is an intrinsic motivation to do this, to build a better foreign policy. And so I'm slightly worried in the Korean case how this is driven by a certain presidency, where a new presidency may want to leave another mark on how to deal with society. But it is actually, not just in South Korea, not just in the Netherlands, but many countries, there is really an intrinsic interest of engaging with society. And rather than doing that for reasons of keeping funding and getting legitimacy, one can see that there are multi-layered reasons why governments find it in their own interest to do this. And that's very interesting. And that indeed, that's the question, I hope, is where social media are offering a wonderful environment to have that exchange with society, where of course governments are also taking into account that there is in many countries a crisis of confidence between government and society, and that party democracies don't function so well. So with a reduced interest in identity association with political parties, there is a space here for diplomacy at home. So we agree, it's not an oxymoron. Thank you.
Thank you for your answers. And Dr. Manner?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that by now we have about 20 years of academic research on digital diplomacy and almost 20 years of experience. And I think we've learned something very important, that digitalization is often impacted by institutional mentalities. And you have foreign ministries that are risk averse, and you have foreign ministries that are risk prone. And the risk prone foreign ministries tend to excel in digitalization, because we know that using digital tools is many times the result of trial and error. It's the result of experimentation, and the foreign ministries that best leverage digital tools encourage their diplomats to experiment. They then look at best practices and try to scale them up. And we find that different foreign ministries have different attitudes towards digital. So the British Foreign Office, which is very risk prone, has a guidebook of all kinds of examples of what you as a diplomat can do on the digital space. The Swiss Foreign Ministry, which is risk averse, has an entire guidebook on what to do on digital space. So I would say that a risk-prone attitude and liberating diplomats is essential for digitalization. And finally, also remembering that the half-life of a digital mistake is very, very short. So if an ambassador tweets something and creates havoc in another country and a very negative backlash, it is usually forgotten within 24 hours because some celebrity has introduced an ice bucket challenge, or some crisis has flared up somewhere. So that's also good to keep in mind. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that's a very interesting research topic. Risk prone tend to have a very more open kind of guidance, but then which is not really happening in Korea right now, as I see it. So that would be a very interesting research topic, I think. And Director Lee, would you answer the question?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's actually a very important question to practitioners, especially those who have to gain support from the domestic audience and especially National Assembly, taxpayers. We have to get budget to continue our projects, digital diplomacy projects. So the easiest way to persuade people that our project was useful is to, show your quantitative index. So key performance index for us is most important index is, of course, subscribers and the number of views. But at the same time, we also analyze the replies the viewers have made, comments. But at the same time, we have our own argument, like this digital content was very timely because this touches upon very important ongoing issue the world is interested in. So we just makes this kind of argument to National Assembly, members of Parliament, when we have to do so. But I have to admit that quantitative indices are most important. Thank you.
Thank you for your answers. Well, we have about 2 minutes left, and I will try to wrap up this session with some of the takeaway points that I think I can gather from our session. Professor Mellison really emphasized the fact that we have to really remember the core value or the core function or the core objective of public diplomacy before we can talk about digital public diplomacy. And he emphasized how we should actually connect the traditional public diplomacy dialogue and with the new media-driven public diplomacy. And how we are going to bridge that is going to be the huge task that we as academicians or practitioners have to look into. And also, many of our discussants emphasized how the communication should be a two-way symmetrical rather than being a one-way message propagandic model. And we have to think about more participatory communication with diverse, multi-layered publics, including local and international arena. And we also saw some of the examples or some of the cases that is actually put out through in terms of using digital media by looking at our discussant Sophie, where she talked about how the Netherlands embassy is practicing, and we also talked about how Korean government is also trying to delve into the digital public diplomacy arena. And I'm sure that I'm not going to be the only one who kind of can understand and see the interdisciplinary nature of public diplomacy. And as it relates to digital diplomacy, I think it invites more disciplines to work with our interest in public diplomacy, because I can see so many resemblance of the constructs that you are interested in talking about digital diplomacy, in which digital public relations is talking about right now. So I think there is a very many creative ways that we can work with, I think. And I hope that this session provided our audience or our viewers helpful information and inspiration for their own public diplomacy endeavors. And I hope they have several key points or takeaway points to take home with them. Well, thank you so very much for your keynote speech, and thank you all for our excellent panelists as well. And I hope that you guys had a creative time here, and I think it's kind of cool to hold this hybrid format of roundtable. It's the first time that I moderated a hybrid version of it, but I think it's quite doable. So I'll see you in Meta Universe next time. Well, thank you so much.
네, 감사합니다. 포스트 팬데믹 시기의 정책 주창을 위한 디지털 공공외교를 주제로 기조 연설과 라운드 테이블을 진행해 주신 얀 멜리슨 교수님과 네 분의 패널분들, 그리고 이윤아 교수님께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀드립니다. 이로써 2021 정책공공외교 포럼의 마지막 세션까지 모두 마쳤습니다. 오늘 포럼은 규범 공공외교의 향방은 공공외교에 대한 다학제적 접근이라는 대주제로 국내외 학자분들과 정책 결정자분들과 함께 공공외교와 관련한 다양한 시각을 공유하고 지식의 깊이를 더할 수 있었던 뜻깊은 시간이었던 것 같습니다. 이번 포럼 준비를 위해서 많은 분들이 애써주셨는데요. 특히나 고생해주신 조기숙 한국공공외교학회장님과 또 김태환 연구위원장님, 이고은 사무국장님과 또 이 포럼을 후원해주신 외교부에게도 심심한 감사 인사드립니다. 그리고 온 오프라인상에서 포럼과 함께 해주신 모든 참석자분들께도 감사하다는 말씀드립니다. 그럼 이상으로 2021 정책공공외교 포럼을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.